first year of seminary, I discovered two truths which formed my first real paradox in my life. The first truth is kind of the one you expect when you start seminary. For the first time I'm reading the scriptures, first time I'm praying regularly, and I discovered that there was a God who existed and that he wanted my ultimate happiness, and that was his big goal in life. So I discovered this truth, it's making me happy, and of course that leads to decisions. So I remember sitting there in seminary and deciding, I have a lot of negative self-talk. Up to that point I've been using it to coach myself into the Hollywood dream so that I would get the Letterman jacket, the cheerleader girlfriend, everything that makes a successful teenager. And I thought, negative self-talk is not really working out in terms of either making me cool or happy, so I'm going to just stop. I'm going to flip the switch, no longer say anything negative to myself, and I'm going to be happy. So I walked out of the seminary building thinking about how I was going to accomplish this great goal. I started walking up a snowbank, and my foot landed on an inclined bit of snow and slipped in ever so slightly, so that I was a little pigeon-toed. And immediately, the thoughts that started pouring through my mind were, you are clumsy, you are not coordinated, all the cool kids are coordinated, you'll never be loved, this is why you don't have any friends, this is why you'll never be successful in life, your life is over. And I had to kind of shake myself to say, well, first of all, that's a leap, and second of all, how did this get out of control? This was my second truth that I discovered, that my happiness was not in my control. That because of my negative self-talk and the accompanying depression, I was incapable of a fullness of happiness. So as I'm discovering these two truths, I see, okay, on one hand, there's a God whose ultimate goal is to make me happy. On the other hand, there is a God who gave me the biology and circumstances that made happiness impossible. So this paradox bothered me. I could not see how these two truths could coexist. And so I thought, okay, well, one of these has to be true, and one of them has to be false. And I kept diving deeper into them. I started thinking, okay, so does God really love me? And the more I studied that, the more my conviction that he existed and loved me and wanted me happy became deeper and more true to me, on a level that was deeper than even academic knowledge. And so I started analyzing my depression. Well, is my depression something that I can really just turn off? Is it something that is actually under my control and I just need a little practice? So the more I studied that, the more I fought my depression, I realized, that is not in control either. And this paradox of a God who both wants my eternal happiness and made it impossible bothered me. For a couple of years, I started looking for the answer, and eventually I got to a point where I suddenly felt peace on the issue. It was as if the peace were saying both, you're right that God loves you, and you're right that you cannot have a fullness of happiness because of depression. And when I got this peace, I thought, this is not the answer I'm looking for. I wanted to throw it back at God and say, I'm sorry, you missed the memo. This was supposed to be logic. I'm supposed to understand how these two pieces could ever fit together. And eventually I came to the realization, no, guess what? You're just going to get peace. You're not going to have true, full understanding of the issue. Now this was one of my first experiences with the different forms of knowledge that exist. One of the first ones, and the ones that I've been emphasizing, was logic. Logic is where I'm able to put the puzzle pieces together, where I'm able to understand how everything functions. The second type of knowledge that has influenced me is trust. And that is where I found individuals or sources that I knew I could rely on. Where maybe I didn't understand everything, or I didn't quite feel at ease with things, but because of who was saying it to me, I knew there was something to be gleaned from it. I knew that that was a form of knowledge I could accept. Another form of knowledge that I acquired was direction. So for direction, that is where not necessarily knowing which side is right, which side is wrong, not necessarily knowing how everything comes together, but I know what I need to do about it. And the last form of knowledge is the one I've already talked about, which is emotion. That either peaceful feeling or even an uneasy feeling when it comes to understanding an issue. Now, all of these different forms of knowledge are valuable. As an individual, I tend to be fairly cerebral. I also grew up in a family and culture that valued academia and understanding logic. Therefore, for me, logic was the ultimate form of knowledge, which is that same prioritization that made me want to throw peace back at God, or in other circumstances, throw trust back, or direction back, or another form of knowledge back, because it wasn't logic. So, what I found, however, was that when I accepted the peace, instead of throwing it back, that's when I was able to have a peaceful paradox, where it was something where I couldn't put all the pieces together. There was still logic lacking, but I was okay with it. It wasn't the end of the world, and it didn't mean that I was wrong. Now, these different paradoxes have come up all the time. It seems like my 20s have been the decades of paradoxes. The decade of paradoxes just full of different issues coming up, different things that kind of shake my faith a little bit, shake things up, make me rethink what I believe. And at times, I'll come across an issue. For example, there was a highly publicized issue where the two sides were both fighting for causes that I agreed with, but they were very opposed to each other. And as I tried to understand it, I tried to study both issues, see, okay, well, which side is actually right, instead of logic, and even instead of emotion. What I ended up getting was direction, which was, hey, notice how both of these sides demonize each other. Instead of finding out what side I want you fighting on, here's what you need to do. You need to get in the middle and be that peacemaker. You need to end the demonization from both directions. Now, do I still know the logic of which side on that issue is right? No, I don't. But I know what I need to do with it, and I accept that knowledge. So I have my different forms of knowledge that I prefer. I have the ones that are a little harder for me to accept. But accepting these different knowledges make me feel at peace on issues. There, a great Christian philosopher, G.K. Chesterton, also addressed paradoxes, and he, speaking specifically about the Christian paradox, said, "And the more I considered Christianity, the more I found that while it had established a rule and order, the chief aim of that order was to give room for good things to run wild." While he was faced with these paradoxes, as he accepted other perspectives, as he accepted other forms of knowledge, he was able to find peace in that paradox, and was able to be broader in his understanding of knowledge. Now, I personally believe in a God that is omniscient. That means that he does not just have knowledge that is logical, but that he also values the different forms of logic, even beyond the forms that I've listed here. He regularly tells me when I start to get a little upset and say, hey, I'm waiting here, where's my answer? He says, have I not already spoken peace to your heart? Basically, accept the knowledge that I've already given you. And I believe that he does prioritize these different forms of knowledge. When I think about Christ coming down, and he comes down and he takes upon himself all the afflictions of the world. And he does that so that he can know according to the flesh how to succor his people. Now, he'd already been succoring his people for centuries, millennia, really. And he was no amateur at it. He had all the knowledge required to properly succor his people. But he valued that knowledge that was acquired in a different form, in the manner of the flesh. This fullness of knowledge does lead us to peace. As I've looked back on my 20s at the different paradoxes that have bothered me, whether they be women's issues, LGBT, and how that fits into the plan of salvation, all of these different paradoxes that I don't fully understand. I think, how did I survive this? How did my faith get through this? And how come I still believe in God? And as I've looked back at it, I look at the 14 years of peace that I have had with regards to my depression and my quest for eternal happiness. And more important than the peace itself is the acceptance of that peace, of that acceptance of that form of knowledge. Because now I can look back and say, you know what? I came to know God when I wasn't at peace. I came to know Him amid depression. If I had just come to know God when I didn't have depression, when things were dandy, everything was lovely, rainbows, all of that, my faith would have not lasted through my 20s. It would have crumbled because I would have just said, you know what, the whole God concept, it's for the people who are too naive, who have not yet discovered the nuances that exist in real life and how complicated real life actually is. Because I discovered those truths at the same time, forming that paradox, I've been able to survive the paradoxes of my 20s. Now, finally, after 14 years of peace, I find that I have the knowledge, the logical knowledge of how my depression complements my eternal happiness. And I found that true, that as I accept these different forms of knowledge, and I don't reject them and throw them back at God because it's not the form I want, that is how I find peaceful paradoxes. Thank you.